No mai, haere mai, piki mai, tauti mai, whakarongo mai, whānau. Welcome to episode, or not, Natives Be Woke. Wow. We've been doing this a while now, haven't we?
Six times.
Six times. Just feel like we've been doing it. I actually, in the context of today's episode, where we'll be talking about her story and activism in Ōtepoti, individual and collective. This has been happening for a long time, that our podcasts are a little bit of a Jenny come lately summary of what we've seen happening around us as we've become adults. So it's a real pleasure to have Suzanne with us today.
Oh, kia ora.
Kia ora. Welcome.
That's a nice intro.
Because you've been in the thick of it, and I want to hear about it.
Okay.
And I know that I'm not the only one.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a real pleasure to have you here today, and we've got Irene on our technology.
Technology for the win.
New Aunty Irene.
Oh, Aunty Irene.
Aunty Irene.
Aunty.
Yeah. Well, actually, in our culture, it's mummy.
Oh yeah.
So it's like I'm Tete I, which just means mummy Irene, or Tete Irene. And the word means mummy rather than auntie.
Isn't that interesting?
So
Your cousin will be the auntie.
Hey?
Your cousin would be the auntie.
Correct. Yeah. So it means that your connection to the baby is just that little bit more drawn in, and you take responsibility as another mum.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah.
Cool.
So
Isn't that beautiful?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
very special.
And in the Kupa Māori Tete is emerging frond.
Oh, that's even more beautiful.
Yeah. So you know that lovely, like the inner bit of the.
Of the kore.
Yeah.
Wow.
What a lucky little baby.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So talking about supporting whānau and communities, let's talk about activism in Dunedin. Or anything. Take us back.
Well, I suppose I was a very compliant school pupil. I didn't rebel at school at all. I think I was raised Catholic. Dad and Mum were, quite sort of pillars in the parish. Mum had been to school with half the nuns who taught me, or been taught by the others. So there was no sort of secrets. I knew that if I did anything that was going to embarrass the family, I'd get into deep stock at home. I'd get thrashed, actually, because we did have a number of straps hanging on the kitchen door that used to be used for giving us hidings. So it wasn't until I left school and I joined the Catholic Youth Movement, which eventually became YCW, Young Christian Workers. And that was a group, was international, set up by a Belgian cardinal who wanted to support activism in the church, but that wasn't Marxist based, because there was lots of communist things starting for young people. This was back at the turn of the 20th century, I suppose. And so he set up this Young Christian Workers, which was people who were working or studying, but actually training them or giving them a space to become radicalised. And in Dunedin it was very sort of ho-hum and stayed, but because I was involved on a national level, they send you to training schools and stuff. And then I started to get really angry about the Catholic Church and about the wealth of the church and about the rhetoric not matching the reality. And so I started challenging some of the chaplains, especially the ones. He was very annoying, and in fact, I remember challenging him at this meeting about, we're talking about the poor and Jesus came for the poor and how come the Vatican's so wealthy and all the churches are so wealthy and blah, blah, blah. So basically, he'd try and shut it down, but it just made me more angry. And so eventually, Tony and I, who I married, he was an ex-seminarian, and my brothers had warned me about him, saying, never marry an ex-seminarian, they push out babies like a sausage machine. This is the elegant conversation advice from my brothers. Anyway, he wasn't like that. And so, luckily for me, there was no opposition from my parents because he was an ex-seminarian, but he and I started on this radicalised path together. And long story short, by the time we got married and moved back to Dunedin, I had a baby. A friend came down from Auckland who'd been in YCW, and she was interested in setting up a women's group to be active in the community alongside a group that Sonia Davies had set up in Wellington called the Working Women's Council. So that was a sort of a parliamentary level, and this was Working Women's Alliance, and it was supposed to be a group of women in the home and women in the workforce coming together to support each other, to protest about stuff, whether it was about what was happening in the homes, this is in the 70s, in the home, or supporting women in the workplace in terms of salary or whatever. So we did a whole lot of stuff. But then in 1975, at one of our meetings, a member of the Dunedin Collective brought along this woman and said, there's no refuge for battered women in Dunedin. You've got to go to Salvation Army. And if you have got a son who's over the age of 12, he has to go into the single men's dormitory with the drunks, the old drunks. And we need this and da-da-da-da-da. So this Joker Newman, she was from the Collective, and she'd been around a number of other parts of the Collective, and no one was interested. They all wanted to set up a feminist bookshop. And so we just sort of said, well, if it's that important, someone's got to do something. So we called a public meeting and we set up this original collective to set up Dunedin Women's Refuge. That was 1976. And that was really tough because what happened in the home was sacred and no one was supposed to know about it. So the first woman who actually approached us was married to, who rang us, was married to a Presbyterian minister. So, this whole myth that this only happens to poor people and brown people. We had a woman who was married to a leading trade unionist, and another woman who was married to the president of the one of the local Lions chapters. So they all they saw the write-up after this first meeting. And I don't know, someone must have published our phone numbers, or the police had them, or somebody had them, because we started getting phone calls at home and we didn't have a house, a refuge house. So we started looking after women in our own family homes.
Wow.
That's
huge.
Yeah, so then I got pregnant with my second baby. And so we found a house just to rent, which is down in the student area now, a little place, I think it's on 4th Street. And so we would just have a 24-hour roster of women, mostly the students. Like there was a feminist student group who were really amazing. They used to do every evening and the weekends. And the rest of us who were married with kids or whatever, we would do during the day. And so that happened, and then we got another house just before we left for England in 78. We got a second house in Easter Crescent, and so it went on and on like that. So going overseas for 4 years was a really good break because I was burnt out. I had a toddler and a baby, and we were getting harassed by the police, harassed by the churches, by clergymen ringing up and abusing us for how dare you separate this wife and husband, they're married in the eyes of God.
Wow.
And, it was just, you just wouldn't believe it today. It's so amazing the kind of publicity and support and discussion that there is about family violence and sexual violence and male on female violence and female on male violence. you know, it's something that people talk about. There's still a shame attached for some people, but it's not hidden in it, and you're not stigmatised because you work in that area. But it was bloody tough.
So, interesting that you say that the shame is still attached to it, but shame has been a really useful mechanism to stop people from behaving in certain ways.
That's right.
And clearly it wasn't preventing those behaviours.
No, because it was still that rule of thumb that husbands were entitled to beat their wives as long as they did it with a stick that wasn't thicker than your thumb. And even though the legal status of women had slightly changed. Leaving Dunedin, flying out of Dunedin with Tony and the boys, and we landed and stayed with a friend in Christchurch for a couple of days. And I remember that night the phone rang and I was going, and then I thought, oh no, it's not for me. It was like, oh, it was so amazing to not have to be answering the phone. So anyway, so that was my first sort of real out there activism. We were doing other things too, like I remember we were complaining about excess packaging. This is back in 1976. And we'd go to Woolworths, which then was not a grocery store. It was actually like, I don't know what.
Departments?
Really cheap department store, a bit like Kmart.
Yeah.
And I remember that they were packaging shirts, men's shirts, you know, you'd have a plastic bag and then you'd have plastic under the collar and all this sort of stuff, all this pins
still do
galore.
some, yep.
And so we used to buy stuff and take them out of their packages and take all the bits out and leave them on the counter and just take the thing. So that was back in the end. And I remember we also started, there'd been a group in Christchurch, I don't know what they're called, but they started a Housewives boycott, and they were boycotting I think they were boycotting canned food and coffee or something because it was getting really expensive and wages weren't going up to match the kind of increase in the cost of living. And I remember we had a meeting. Actually, the photo was in the paper. You know, on a Saturday morning they have, 40 years ago what was happening. I think it was the year before last. And I got a couple of emails from people I knew now saying, was that you in the paper? And it was a meeting of the Housewives boycott group that was held at the Pioneer Women's Hall, and we were talking about boycotting Greg's coffee and Cadbury's chocolate biscuits, because talk about first world issues. But Cadbury's were really upset about it, and I got pressure from my cousin's husband who worked in the lab, because it was going to, like, you keep boycotting Cadbury's, you can't boycott Cadbury's, they've got all these jobs and all this stuff. So there was this photo in the paper of this inaugural meeting of the Housewives boycott, and there was I talking to some groups of people. So we did those sort of things. It was all pretty, funny. It was scary.
40 years ahead for its time.
It was scary because women weren't doing this stuff, and I was only 26, and I remember my father thought I had a mental illness because I also wore caftans at this stage. And I remember he came back from Australia saying, the girls in Melbourne are so well got up, beautiful makeup and, it's so neat and tidy and blah, blah, blah. And I knew that was just a dig at me because I didn't wear makeup, I didn't shave my legs, I wore caftans, and I was outspoken and I was rebelling against the church. And so obviously I was mentally ill. So I always laugh at that. I think it's really, really funny. But anyway, so then we went overseas and we got really homesick in London, South London, living there with our 2 wee kids and working quite long hours. And so we happened to see the London Māori Club on TV one night. Used to be a show called The Generation Game. Yeah. And so they were there doing this stuff, and the competitors had to learn how to do the poi or something and do it as well. So we saw them, and there was all these Pākehā in the London Māori Club all dressed up in piu as well. There was Māori as well. So I thought, you must be able to join if you're not Māori. So on Monday morning we rang New Zealand House and asked them, do you know anything about this London Māori? Oh yes, they meet on a Tuesday. So we started going into there every week with our kids. And we got to know them really, everyone really well, and was really good socially. And I made my debut, had to make my own piu and my own putty and all this stuff. Man. Got a photo of me getting ready for my debut with my 2 kids.
We'll ask you about that later.
That was funny. And so it was amazing because that's when I actually that's when I got an idea that something had happened in New Zealand that we didn't know about. And it was because one of the older women there who we used to take to club and bring home back to South London, when I asked her what her maiden name had been, she was a widow, and she said, when I was growing up in Frasertown, up in Kahungunu land, my father told us never to tell the Pākehā what our name was. And I said, why? She said, it was to do with the land, because if the Pākehā farmer knew what our names were, they would be able to access the deeds of whatever, the land trust or whatever, I didn't understand it, and get our land. And I remember I was distraught, because I thought, we were better than the Australians, we were better than the South Africans, we didn't do those nasty things. And all of a sudden, at the age of 28 or 29, I was learning that a whole lot of stuff had happened that I didn't know about, and people were scared of us. And it was just such a horrific learning. And I remember saying, when I go back to New Zealand, we'll find out what happened. I'm not satisfied. I was not satisfied with a lot of things in terms of the church. I'd left the church in England, just got sick of the hypocrisy. It was easy. Yeah, it was really easy. So I came back here, got involved in the Black Women's Movement here, because I've got African ancestry. And it just never stopped from that time, doing anti-racism work and treaty work, and being involved in Corso and meeting people like TAIHOA E HOA, who was also getting involved in Corso, and I still love it, but so it just sort of that's where it started, really. So Corso was interesting, because when we were in England, we heard that Muldoon had cut off Corso's tax deductibility. And so they were no longer charitable status. He said that they were a political party. And he'd also removed about $400,000, which was a Freedom from Hunger campaign given by the UN to various organisations around the world who were in the aid business. And Corso was like the New Zealand recipient, because they were very orthodox when they were set up, in terms of they had the Governor-General was the patron, the Prime Minister and Leader of the Opposition were the sort of the sub-patrons, deputy patrons. So it was very, very mainstream. But it had started to question, they'd been forced to question by overseas partners about what they were doing in New Zealand. And some of the people from Sri Lanka and from South America were saying, well, what do you know about what's the colonial history of this country? And they, of course, they didn't know anything. And they said, well, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And if you don't know what your role is in terms of a colonial society, then you're obviously part of the problem. And so a lot of people left because they were offended, but a lot of people who stayed really started to try and work this out, you see. And so this is why Muldoon had stripped the status of Corso, because they'd made a movie called A Fair Deal, and very naively they had compared the situation of a Māori family living in Poriroa in a state house with a cabinet minister who happened to be Muldoon's best friend and had this big palatial house in Remuera. And so that was a personal thing for Muldoon. And of course, I could have been a bit more discreet. There's plenty of other rich people they could have picked on, but they chose to do that. So then Māori started to, especially in Auckland, started saying, well, how come you're funding water tanks in Vanuatu? So, and how come you're not doing these things for Māori people? We're living in car boxes and stuff in Northland, and we've got no electricity, we've got no running water, blah, blah, blah. So that was a big shock to Corso, and that sort of really radicalised the organisation a lot.
Let us be one.